today's speaker is Adrienne, who is this year's winner of the Eric Zencey Prize in Ecological Economics. And so I want to do just one extra minute of introduction to remind or tell everybody what that prize is about and why it's so special and great that Adrienne's here. So Eric Zencey was an author, a very successful and accomplished author, and an ecological economist. And for many, many years, a member of the Gund Institute community as a fellow and an affiliate. He did a lot of really innovative things, including a lot of work on constructing an alternative to GDP that reflected a lot of the social and environmental, ecological, and equity dimensions that GDP ignores. He also wrote a couple of really widely selling books, and his kind of focus, especially at the end of his career, was to bring ecological economics out of the ivory tower and into everybody's consciousness around the world. He did that by writing. And at the very near end of his life, he established the Eric Zencey Prize. And the hundreds of people who worked with him and loved him contributed to that. Now it is an every 2-year literary prize for the best public-facing, not too wonky writing in ecological economics. And this year, Adrienne won it, which is why she's here to talk about that book. So, a little bit about Adrienne. She's a writer based in London, from Vancouver, I learned yesterday, working on nature, climate change, the economy, and policy. So super, super relevant, of course. This is her second book, as far as I can tell, plus a lot of short form stuff in the Financial Times and the Guardian and other things. She used to work at a progressive think tank called Commonwealth, the director of research there. And she's most recently started a really brand new thing called The Breakdown, which is about exploring the links between capitalism and climate change through interviews and journalism and writing. So she's been here 2 days. She's been super generous with her time, with students and classes and other things. I find her to be thoughtful and funny and very, very smart. And so it's really great that we have her here. So over to you, Adrienne.
Thank you. The nicest introduction and reflects what has been a really warm welcome to everyone here. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to meet so many of you over the past couple of days, and of course, a real honor to be the recipient of this year's Zencey Prize, or last year, I suppose. It's now 2025. Time flies. So today, I'm going to talk a bit about the book for which that prize is awarded, The Value of a Whale. But I think actually what I wanted to do most was to kind of reflect on everything that has changed in the years since writing. I wrote a lot of that work in 2020 and 2021, partly at the height of the pandemic. We all vaguely remember that, strange time. And in the years since, particularly in the sphere of climate politics, things feel radically different. And so I just wanted to start off with some reflections on basically where I began, which was a time where it felt as though, at least in the mainstream, climate denial was sort of on the wane. Sort of overt denial and obstructionism seemed to be receding. And instead, what we were getting was a different kind of sort of obstructive engagement with climate policy. And so I wanted to understand exactly what was still kind of holding us back so significantly from kind of bending the emissions curve and from sort of halting ecological degradation at a time where, at least in the kind of public sphere and on the surface, it was a more difficult time to say, climate change isn't real. Now, obviously, that feels as though it was maybe a premature pronouncement of the death of denialism, to say the least. But nonetheless, that was sort of the vantage point from which I sort of was writing the book. So asking, why, despite all this kind of tremendous progress in the climate movement, despite the kind of mainstreaming of climate policy in a lot of governments, why are we still so kind of far off track? So that was the original question I started with. And the sort of answer I proposed was this kind of framework of what I described at the time as green capitalism. So the kind of policies that were being pursued that I sort of felt were serving primarily as a distraction from the much more transformative economic work that needed to be done to actually kind of get where we needed to be with climate and ecological crisis. So safe to say that in a short amount of time, a lot can change, not least, the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which unfortunately for me happened 12 days after my book was published. So an immediate kind of revision of exactly what's happening in climate policy. But at the same time, the fallout of the pandemic, as well as the invasion of Ukraine, led to a massive spike in energy prices that enormously rehabilitated and increased the profitability of the fossil fuel industry, and in a way that has significantly shaped climate politics around the world since. So what I wanted to do today, as I said, is to kind of take stock of all those changes and to reflect on where I think green capitalism stands today, whether or not it's still relevant as a concept, whether or not we're now facing a new set of challenges, and where I think the task is for those of us who, I imagine, like pretty much everyone in this room, would like to see a future defined by not just sustainability, but also justice and greater equality. So we'll begin naturally with, oh, well, that was that slide. January 17th of this year, a date I'm sure you're all very acutely aware of, where BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, which controls over 11 trillion US dollars in assets, settled a lawsuit out of court that had been brought against it by the Tennessee Attorney General. The lawsuit alleged that BlackRock had violated its fiduciary duties to its clients by being involved in sustainable finance alliances like the sort of Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, a rather bulky acronym among many, which sought to basically have financial firms sign up to some kind of voluntary pledge for alignment with net zero. That settlement came on the heels of a lot of cases beginning over the past couple of years, brought broadly by Republican states and legislatures against the major financial players, anyone kind of signed up to these pledges, sued for violation of fiduciary duties related to their kind of ostensible action on climate in what has been termed the woke capital backlash. And then maybe other people aren't as familiar with that, but I had a really fun time trying to find images of the woke capital backlash for this, which I'll show you now. This was a really strong one, I felt. ESG is apparently sort of kowtowing to fascist governments. My second favorite is this kind of menacing Abraham Lincoln overlooking corporate America, as well as this fun word cloud, which apparently captures woke culture. But all of that to say, the woke capital backlash to me marks, I think, the most significant rupture of what has been a consensus around almost the inevitability of green capitalism over the past few years. So before returning to that and why I think this represents a really significant shift, I just want to return to what was kind of the original framework of the book and the origin of my sort of reflections on green capitalism. So the name of the book sort of was stemmed from a 2019 study by a group of researchers at the International Monetary Fund who sought to put a sort of dollar value on whales as an effort to conserve them. Now, this made meeting Joe Roman a real kind of celebrity meet and greet for me, whose research was sort of problematically included in this. And for me, this wasn't just kind of a niche hobby horse of some kind of research group at the IMF. It was a kind of perfect distillation of what green capitalism and this kind of prevailing consensus around how the world should respond to climate and ecological crisis was defined. There's a lot of reasons to critique this on the science. I'm sure Joe could do that an entire lecture on his own. But focusing, I think, today just on the kind of narrow framework that this encapsulates and sort of represents, which is that climate and ecological crisis is explicitly a market failure. It is framed only in terms of how it can therefore be resolved through the market, typically by internalizing kind of externalities that we have failed to price. We don't price carbon enough, and therefore we over emit. We don't have a value for whales, and you know the rest. And this, up until very recently, was, I think, an almost unassailable consensus in the governments of the US, the UK, much of Europe, and many other places around the world. In the book, I look at sort of several key areas that exemplify this framework, as Elizabeth Pott Berman puts it in her book, of a focus on technologies of market design rather than the much more crude sort of technologies of pollution reduction or actual regulation. And several of these are explored in the book in depth. Sadly, we don't have time to go through all of them today. I'm already just racing through my time. So they included things like carbon pricing and the effort to set up carbon markets, which died a very slow death here with Wax and Murky. The sustainable finance boom, which is what I'm going to focus on today, the kind of ESG phenomenon of the early 2020s. And also looks at things like de-risking international investment in the climate crisis. So seeing the state as a sort of backstop for private profit, as well as a kind of fixation with a sort of win-win green growth orientation in which basically we are able to somehow transform the metabolic foundations of our economy while leaving everything else about how we structure our economies in place. Or to quote a colleague called Jack Hockley, a view in which everything must change but our social relations, the social relations of capitalism. And the simplest way to think of this is that on the finance side, the response to climate and ecological crisis became framed exclusively as a question of quantity. This was a quantitative challenge of scaling up investment in sort of green energy and in sort of new technologies, as opposed to anything resembling a qualitative question about reorganizing how we structure our economies, thinking about alternative ways to organize our lives and our sort of collective societal priorities. And of course, in practice, to accomplish this, the work of government was to find a way to create markets in everything from carbon to biodiversity, as well as to sort of induce the private sector to deliver on its ends. And you end up with all sorts of kind of fun things when you do that, whales being not the only example. I always love to show this. This is a sort of FEMA ecosystem service value table. I'm sure many people in this room are very familiar with ecosystem services calculations, but this one really stands out to me. This was at the sort of like height of the ecosystem service boom when the market was kind of really beginning to be accelerated. And it just, for me, is a perfect example of how when you focus on purely kind of fungible economic value as a way to address ecological crisis, you end up with some very silly things. So if you look at this, this is the value economically of different types of land use and land cover. And obviously beaches and dunes, just orders of magnitude above everybody else, with the underlying reason being aesthetic value. Who gets to decide that? It's hard to say. And basically property valuation and recreation and tourism, meaning that, you know, from an economic perspective, from the value or the perspective of this market, destroying less economically valuable forms of land cover, like a wetland, you know, invaluable carbon sinks, valuable for their own other reasons, intrinsic reasons, is no problem, so long as, you know, more economically valuable ends are maintained. About sort of a sidebar, a bit of a hobby horse. I just love that study. I want to focus today on the sort of investment question. And this, I think, is the sort of beating heart of green capitalism, which is how can we find ways to meet this kind of imagined finance gap in ways that don't require the state to have any kind of confrontation with the sort of messiness of politics, with trying to actually allocate public money, to coordinate public investment, to kind of have anything under its own control. And this sort of culminated in a time at which the asset management industry, particularly in the United States, was not only enormously on the rise, but incredibly concentrated, with only a handful of top firms controlling the vast majority of assets under management, and crucially being universally exposed across the economy. So if you are BlackRock, that's its CEO shown there, not only do you control trillions of assets, but you are exposed across the entire economy, meaning that the climate crisis for you is a sort of twofold challenge. One, it is a tremendous risk to the value of your assets. And two, self-described by Larry Fink, it is the sort of greatest investment opportunity in history. And this sort of dual challenge informed a lot of policy at the time, both as a reflection of policymakers' desire to sort of outsource the challenge of investment to the private sector, and the kind of convenient marriage of that goal with the aims of the asset management industry itself, which found itself at a time of kind of unprecedented influence. It's notable that several BlackRock alumni went on to prominent positions in the Biden administration, without getting too conspiratorial about it. And BlackRock was brought on to consult on, you know, the EU sustainable finance regimen, for example. recognized as this kind of inescapable influence at this time. Sorry, let me just catch up on my notes here. So this sort of touches on what I've described before. If you are the kind of private financial sector, there is a considerable risk, and this comes up in the sort of question of stranded assets. So if you are universally distributed as an investor across the economy, of course, you are massively invested in capital and assets that stand to basically go up in smoke if we were to do anything like meet sort of a 1.5 degree target for warming. Estimates of how exactly this is valued range a lot, but it's at least $1 trillion in assets just on kind of listed financial markets, creating obviously a really significant vested interest for these players. And the other is finding new ways to kind of maximize your returns in the development of this new economy. And what this led to was the kind of ESG boom that the woke capital backlash was kind of based on. Clearly have a fixation with Larry Fink, yet another quote. Maybe it's a crush, who knows? But this just shows the absolutely massive surge that sort of peaked around the time of the pandemic in ESG investing, which is sort of environmental sustainable governments investing. This is just fund inflows, but estimates of the kind of overall assets that scaled up were from an 8-fold increase between 2015 and 2021 in ESG fund assets. And by 2020, assets around the world invested ostensibly according to ESG criteria topped about $30 trillion US. New kind of financial products that were sort of meant to deliver green outcomes also surged at this time. Things like sustainability-linked bonds, which will replace green bonds, which actually required firms to kind of undertake green activities. They kind of allowed firms to set their own sort of arbitrary targets. These became enormously popular around this time. And the critical, I guess, challenge of this was that, well, there's several. One, it created, I think, an incredibly compelling veneer for policymakers of progress. The idea that the private sector was stepping in, or to quote Tarek Fancy, who used to work at BlackRock and subsequently became a sort of whistleblower, the idea that Wall Street's got this. And it's an incredibly useful tool as a government wishing to avoid the thorny political challenges of climate to kind of sidestep those responsibilities, hand it over to the private sector under the idea that kind of rational markets and the profit motive, if given the right inducements by the public sector, will deliver. Now, needless to say, I think, there's been plenty of time and work spent kind of popping the ESG bubble in the years since. But I think the important takeaway of the kind of flaws with the ESG model is not necessarily some of the more egregious cases of overt greenwashing, although those are bad. It's that this was always, because it was mediated through financial markets in the way that sort of green capitalism is fixated, it was always a question of mitigating risk for economic actors rather than confronting their actual role in materially changing the nature and composition of the economy. So if you looked at, at the time, the average climate fund, this is some research I did with Commonwealth, overwhelmingly investment was in big tech, financials, real estate investment trusts, and something like energy comes in at the absolute bottom of the portfolio. And this is because the entire premise of this kind of green capitalist financial market framework is in the interests of the financial players at hand. Sometimes this might align with the kind of ends of actually building up the green economy that we were interested in, but there's nothing that sort of requires the interests of a BlackRock to actually be aligned with those outcomes. This manifests, I think, in increasingly ridiculous ways, one of which was a study of ESG funds based on the Russell 3000, which is like an index of mid-sized companies. And it found that far and away, the most significant difference between ESG funds and regular funds based on that impact, on that index rather, was that the ESG funds selected for companies with no employees. Because if you don't have employees, you don't have governance and labor rights risks. And the exact same thing could be said of how ESG approached climate. So all of this kind of came to a head, this sort of halcyon days of hands-off governance, of tweaks and market inducements with the Inflation Reduction Act passed in 2022. And admittedly, at the time, I initially thought this is a sort of confrontation with everything I have just written in this book, this kind of hands-off approach of inducements to the private sector, until we kind of looked under the hood of what was actually sort of involved in the act. And I'm sure many people here quite familiar with it, so I apologize if I'm rehearsing things that you know very well. But in my view, the Inflation Reduction Act was almost the sort of apex of the high days of green capitalism, insofar as its primary goal, through the uncapped tax credits, or what I've heard sort of many colleagues describe as bottomless mimosas, uncapped tax credits for renewable energy firms and sort of other kind of equivalent industries as inducements to investors to move into this space, carving out new infrastructural projects for the kind of titans of private equity and asset management to invest in and to own, alongside some of the actually more progressive elements like direct pay, which enabled groups like municipalities or nonprofits to access these tax credits, which was previously not available, and of course, massive concessions to the fossil fuel industry. So I think the Inflation Reduction Act, for me, as I've said already, is kind of the perfect end point of what to date has been this green capitalist consensus. In its sort of Faustian bargain with the fossil fuel industry, making massive concessions just in order to kind of sweep across inducements for the public sector to backstop private gains, rather than negotiating major public investment in renewable energy, major public investment in new infrastructures, and ultimately hitching the entire sort of program of US climate policy to the profit imperative, to uncoordinated private sector actors, each of whom acts as its own kind of balkanized unit, making decisions individually in a transition that needs to be sort of massively coordinated and planned, and doing so in a way that basically conceded all demands to capital. It was described by many people in the kind of climate space as this unbelievably significant sort of climate legislation, this sort of groundbreaking break with all preceding consensus, when I think, in fact, it was sort of the ultimate endgame of where green capitalism was leading. And it led, despite its scale, to the exact same kind of pitfalls that green capitalism has always faced, which is its inherent kind of reliance on the profit imperative and the vulnerability that that creates. So this is just a couple of examples in which, despite these massive subsidy regimes, sort of auctions for offshore wind struggled increasingly to attract private investors because you enter into kind of arms race of profitability in which you are constantly being asked to make greater and greater concessions to their demands. I don't really have time to go through all of these, I think, because I'm slightly running out of time. But this is just also showing that in the same time period, you guys had a really great fossil fuel boom. It was awesome. Okay, Biden up there. Yeah, there you go. And ultimately, in these concessions, it also represented the kind of other darker side of the green capitalist framework, which is that in abdicating any kind of public coordination of this transition, in tethering every kind of decision and action to private profit making, you end up acting as though decarbonization is taking place, at least at a national level, in a vacuum. So this is just some articles from around that time, showing how the inducement of private sector actors to invest in so-called emerging markets, so nothing but kind of increase their vulnerability to the impacts and shocks of the climate crisis. And also, sorry, I keep clicking around, I need to change the slides. Finally, its complete failure to engage with the much more complicated questions around sort of distribution and the actual politics of the climate crisis, which is that ultimately, and I think, again, speaking to a room of ecological economists, this is a distributional question. We have utterly no evidence that we can, decouple growth from material throughput, very poor evidence of our ability to decouple emissions in an absolute sense from GDP growth as well. And doing so is the entire sort of premise on which green capitalism is formed. For a capitalist system to survive, growth is the imperative, profit is the imperative. That's not a judgment, it's just sort of a statement of fact. And in that kind of a system, you have no ability to kind of reconcile that growth is on a global level kind of distributed in a way that contributes to escalating extraction and harm around the world. So I think I'm kind of on time. It's really quick go through. So that was an unbelievably sort of rushed run through of kind of the idea of green capitalism and where it now stands. And I think the sort of question that I wanted to visit in this talk is ultimately, and we touched on this a little bit yesterday with some of the grad students, is, you know, given the scale of the challenge that we're facing, given the kind of utter failure so far to bend the emissions curve to kind of halt degradation of our natural world, when are the kinds of concessions made in the Inflation Reduction Act or equivalent kind of policies of green capitalism worthwhile? When are they sort of necessary evils, or evils is a strong word, but sort of necessary concessions in order to make some kind of progress at all? You know, we're sort of grasping for crumbs here. And when are they sort of an active harm from the project of actually delivering a sustainable world? And it's a question that I don't necessarily have a settled answer to. My mind changes all the time, although I feel increasingly, and I think this is embodied in the kind of woke capital backlash, and why, you know, I realize it's a bit of a silly meme thing, but I actually think it's quite significant, which is that despite all of these concessions to the interests of capital, you know, ultimately refusing or failing to take it on leaves you open to a profound degree of vulnerability. And the failure of, I think, kind of liberal governments and liberal politicians to engage with the necessary sort of conflictual, thorny questions of sort of redistribution and of, you know, coordination and planning and governance of our resources is not only sort of a delay tactic and has not only led us so far off course, but if anything, it sort of opens up the space for capital and for obstructive forces against action on climate to sort of be even more effective in their kind of backlash to that work. So I suppose I still don't have a firm answer on that question, though, as I said, I feel every day that we're being, you know, demonstrated very clearly that the time, you know, is no longer available to us to make the kind of concessions that a green capitalist program did for so many years. And the time is now to kind of actually try and build alternatives to the system and to kind of directly confront the kind of vested interests and forces that continue to perpetuate a deeply unsustainable economic model. And I'll just leave you with this quote from an investor called BCA Global Investment Solutions, which I think captures the logic of so much of what we talked about and the risks of sort of tethering your project to the imperatives of the market. And that was in 2022. I wonder how bullish they would feel today. Thank you. I feel like I really rushed through that, but I was really conscious of time. So